Mexico's president, Claudia Sheinbaum, slammed Trump's tariff threat yesterday, suggesting her country could retaliate with its own tariffs. She also claimed migrant caravans are no longer reaching the border with the United States. The comments were made during a press conference yesterday in which Sheinbaum read from a letter she sent to Donald Trump. She said, quote, allocating even a fraction of what the United States spends on warfare toward peace building and development would address the deeper drivers of migration. Sheinbaum went on to blame the United States for its role in drug trafficking, saying, quote, 70% of the illegal weapons seized from criminals in Mexico come from your country. Tragically, it is in our country that lives are lost to the violence resulting from meeting the drug demand in yours. President Sheinbaum of Mexico in a letter to Donald Trump. We mentioned Donald Trump also threatened an additional 10% tariff on goods from China for its role in fentanyl trafficking. Yesterday, a spokesperson for China's foreign ministry called the drug issue a, quote, American problem, saying China has provided support in dealing with that and that the U.S. should, quote, cherish China's goodwill. Joining us now, former Treasury official and Morning Joe economic analyst Steve Rattner and congressional reporter for The Hill, Michael Schnell. Good morning to you both. Good to see you. So, Steve, you've been educating us about tariffs for many years now. 25% in Mexico, 25% in Canada, our two largest trading partners, would do what, in your eyes, to the price of everyday goods here in the United States?
Well, it's going to raise it pretty significantly, Willie. And as your report from Hallie Jackson just said, one of the things that I think we all learned during the campaign is that tariffs are a tax. They add to the price of the goods. They're not paid for by the companies. They're paid for by consumers. But let me make one point that sometimes doesn't get underlined the way it probably should in this debate, which is it doesn't just raise the price of the goods that are imported from that foreign country, some washing machine from China, some car from Mexico, whatever. It raises the prices of all of those goods because the whole fact that one of the real points of tariffs is if you raise the price on an imported good that's competing with a U.S. manufacturer, it allows the U.S. manufacturer to also raise his prices to that same level. And so if we put a tariff on Chinese washing machines, as we did under the first President Trump term, it's going to raise the price of all washing machines in this country. And so it could add as much as you heard as 1% to inflation, which is a lot given that inflation is not yet down to the 2% target that the Fed has established.
Given the team that Donald Trump has assembled, his proposed cabinet choices, advisors, is it a group of people, some who I assume you know, others you don't, who would be supportive of this? Because there is still that idea that this is rhetoric, that he's trying to get Mexico to crack down on the border, he's getting China to stop its bad behavior, and he's not actually going to impose some of these tariffs. Do you believe these actually will come into place on day one?
I don't necessarily believe they're going to come in place on day one. We all know Trump's negotiating tactic, which is you take the most extreme position possible and then you work yourself back from that. And indeed, in his first term, he did impose some tariffs, but they were never these 10% across the board to every import or 25% and so forth. I think we can take a little bit of nervous solace, I'll call it nervous solace, from the appointments so far. Scott Bessent at Treasury, Howard Lutnick at Commerce, and now Kevin Hassett yesterday appointed to head the National Economic Council. I wouldn't call, I mean, they're certainly not Democrats, and I wouldn't necessarily call them pro-trade or anti-tariff people, but they, I think, more measured. It's very notable that Robert Lighthizer, who was the advisor to Trump during the campaign, who was most vocal about tariffs, does not have a government position. One of his deputies from the first term is going to be the special trade representative, but that's put under Howard Lutnick now, who's a bit more moderate. And Peter Navarro, who is certainly the biggest spear-carrying, wild-eyed, anti-China guy in the first Trump administration, does not have a position at all yet. So we can find a few slightly hopeful signs that there'll be some grown-ups in the room as they go through this process.
Peter Navarro of Green Bay sweep fame.
That's right.
That was his effort to overturn the election. So, Michael, this was an election that was largely fought about the economy and prices. Inflation, polls suggest, was one of the biggest drivers of voters to Republicans. But if Donald Trump goes through this, prices are going to rise
Right.
again. How does Congress right now, the Senate and the House with a very slim majority, how are these Republicans feeling about this?
It's a bit of a mixed bag, right? We're hearing from a number of those hardline conservative Republicans who say this is great. Mexico, China, Canada, they need to face these tariffs. We're especially hearing from some border state Republicans who say that this needs to be done to stop the spread of fentanyl, to stop the illegal immigration, which is what President-elect Trump has tied it to. But there are still some skeptics. For example, Chuck Grassley, right? A longtime senator, Republican from Iowa. He's conservative. You can definitely argue that he's conservative. He said that he's concerned about the potential effect of these tariffs, about these rising prices. But what he came back in the second breath has said is that I see this as a negotiating tactic. I think a lot of Republicans are saying that this is what Trump does. He makes those lofty threats and uses that as a negotiating tactic to bring folks to the table. I think Republicans are concerned about the rising prices and the rising inflation that can come with this. So they're hoping that it's going to be a negotiating tactic and these tariffs won't actually make it come to fruition.
Steve, you certainly have not been exactly optimistic that Donald Trump's tenure is going to return to the American dream, as you recently wrote in the Times. Can you talk a little bit about the source of your overall pessimism about the economic environment that Donald Trump faces and his proposed solutions to it?
Yeah, look, if you believe that two of the biggest problems we face in this country are, one, still maintaining inflation at a low level and getting it back to all the way to its 2%, and secondly, what I call restoring the American dream, the fact that we've had so many workers left behind, the fact that the famous white middle class, working class people out in Ohio have seen their wages after inflation go down, and the huge pressures that people have on their costs. It is very hard to find anything in the Trump 2.0, shall we call it, program that would address that. He's talking about tariffs, which we just talked about, inflationary. He's talked about massive tax cuts on all kinds of different things from overtime pay to tips and so forth, massively increasing the deficit potentially, which puts upward pressure on interest rates, makes it harder for people to buy houses, and also creates more inflation when we spend more money. And so when you go through, and then of course deporting all the illegal immigrants, many of these people who are very engaged productively in the country and who we still need, we still have more jobs than we have people looking for jobs. All of these things are actually negatives for the economy. So it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out, but I just don't see how his policies line up with what we need to do to address the problems we're facing.
And part of this, Steve, also is the tax cut. If the tax cut comes back, which the vast majority of which the benefits went to rich people, to corporations, or people at least making over $75,000 a year, if that comes back, what does that do to the economy?
Yeah, look, that's the thing. It's a $4 trillion bill for the next 10 years to simply extend the Trump tax credits at a time when we're already running a $2 trillion deficit. It's not like we're running no deficit. It flies against all sorts of economic wisdom. When the economy is doing reasonably well, as it is at the moment in terms of growth, you don't then, put more gasoline on the fire. That is not the way to run economic policy. They've talked about all these spending cuts, but there really isn't enough. It's another discussion for another day. There really isn't enough spending that you actually can cut without getting into Social Security, Medicare, defense. Obviously, you can't cut interest on the debt and so forth.
So, Michael, let's shift to another part of the Trump transition. He and his team finally struck an agreement with the Biden administration and the federal government for the transition funding program and the like. And he has now filled out his cabinet. There's still a few key posts, FBI director among them, that haven't been named yet. But there's shaping up to be a bit of a fight here on a few of these picks. What's the very latest as to what Republicans, particularly those in the Senate, feel about Tulsi Gabbard, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and particularly Pete Hegseth?
Yeah, it's those three names that we keep coming back to since, well, we should note those three names since Matt Gaetz withdrew his name from consideration for Attorney General. He was the one who was receiving the most scrutiny. He was receiving the most oxygen in the room. With him out of the question, we're now hearing about those three, RFK, Pete Hegseth, and Tulsi Gabbard. And the concerns are there, particularly with Pete Hegseth right now. He's the one who's getting the most scrutiny. He's most in the spotlight. The details that came out from that police report about that alleged sexual assault in 2017, those are raising concerns among senators, right? And Tulsi Gabbard, her past foreign international travel, her past comments about the Russia-Ukraine war, parroting things that have been said on Russian state TV, causing concern, and then RFK Jr. and his vaccine skepticism. So we're going to see how this all plays out with A, their meetings with senators on Capitol Hill, B, what those confirmation hearings look like, the information that comes out, the questions that are asked, and then C, of course, that all-important vote that's going to come in likely the first few weeks of the Trump administration. Right now, what we're hearing from Republican senators is that there are some of these concerns, but folks are keeping an open mind. They want to say that President-elect Trump has the opportunity to fill his cabinet with people who he wants to. They want to give them the benefit of the doubt, but they're going to come armed with their fair share of questions come those confirmation hearings. Now, of course, it's all going to come down to a numbers game because it's just a simple majority to confirm these folks. Republicans have 53 seats in the Senate. Obviously, if it's a 50-50, J.D. Vance can come in and break that tie. But there are a good handful of these Republicans on Capitol Hill in the Senate who are not Trump's biggest fans. It's the names we talk about all the time: Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, Tom Tillis. There are a few of them. Depending on how they vote is going to depend on these nominees, whether or not they can get in the cabinet, and depending on how many they're willing to tank and vote no against. It would be a pretty resounding thing for a Republican to vote against a Republican president's nominee. It's going to be interesting to see how many they're willing to stick their neck out on and tank when you're dealing with the potential wrath and retribution that could come from the president-elect with those cabinet
And
picks.
there's the sense from the Trump side that, okay, we pulled Matt Gaetz back. We gave you one. We heard you don't like him. We told him to step back. Don't you dare cross us on these other ones, as if he was the sacrificial lamb. But when you dig through, as you said, Pete Hegseth, you dig through these stories, you dig through some of the views of Bobby Kennedy Jr., and of course Tulsi Gabbard's affinity for Russia, for Assad and Syria, and things like that. There are real concerns among Republicans. Do you think, as one of their first acts in this new presidency, though, that they will, enough of them anyways, you say it only takes 4,
right,
enough of them will step out and cross him, at least on 1 or 2 of them?
Well, this is something Jonathan and I were talking about the other day. They didn't actually have to use too much political capital on Matt Gaetz. The writing was on the wall right there from the outset. It was clear from those private conversations, but also from the public conversation, that Matt Gaetz did not have any chance of becoming Attorney General, especially with that House Ethics report hanging over his head. So these Republicans, who are not the biggest fans of Trump, they still have that political capital. They haven't fully put it to use yet. Now, as you mentioned, the big question is, are they going to want to do this right out the gate? And that's the key question here. But again, we're talking about folks who don't have a strong affinity for Donald Trump. Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski admitted that they didn't even vote for him. So I don't know if that calculus is going to play in too much when we talk about if they're willing to take this vote.
Yeah, they were able to save their fire because they didn't have to take the vote against Gaetz. I'm told by those in the Hill that Hegseth is probably the one who's in most trouble of these picks. And if Trump were to nominate Kash Patel for a job that would require Senate confirmation, he'd be in trouble as well, which is why I'm told those in Mar-a-Lago are leaning towards installing him somewhere else, perhaps a deputy position where he wouldn't have to face that vote.
And people who care deeply about intelligence in our country are very, very concerned about Tulsi Gabbard as well. So we'll see. All right, the Hill's Michael Schnell, thank you for reporting. Steve Ratner, thank you as well. Happy Thanksgiving to you both. Great to see you. Thanks.